Okay. Is our audience here, Ryan?
They are filing in. Let me get
Okay.
the Facebook Live going. The recording is live as well.
Hi, everybody. We're just going to let people file in for a little bit, and we'll start in a minute or two. For those of you who are already here, we're going to be using the chat feature for you to communicate with us. So feel free to introduce yourself in the chat. We're going to ignore the Q&A function because it's really annoying. Thank you, Zoom. So feel free to open up the chat, just click on it and introduce yourself. And yes, Broderick, it is, hi Broderick, it is being streamed on Facebook. And it will also be recorded and stored at the Southern Labor Archives in Atlanta. Hi, everybody. Just keep introducing yourselves in the chat while we get started. Oh, this is a pretty exciting mix of people. All right, well, let's get started with introductions and we'll take it from there. So welcome to It Didn't Start at Amazon, a conversation about the history of organized labor in the American South. I'm Cindy Hahamovich. I'm the B. Finney Spalding Distinguished Professor of History at the University of Georgia, which is really a mouthful. And I'm also an active member of the United Campus Workers of Georgia, which is one of the sponsors of this event. Before we get started, I want to say a few thank yous, and I hope I don't forget everyone, but I especially want to thank Eric Castater, who just put this together and did lots of work to organize it. He's at Kennesaw State University. Ryan Richardson, Wave Ryan, is up there on Zoom controls. Shira Chess did our poster and fixed the e-registration system that I broke. Several organizations have sponsored and helped advertise this event. So the Atlanta and North Georgia Labor Council, thank you very much. The United Campus Workers, as I mentioned. LACHA, which is the Labor and Working Class History Association. And then also the Southern Labor Studies Association. And if anybody would like to drop those links into the chat, feel free. I can't do two things at once this late in the day. So we are recording this event. We're streaming on Facebook and we'll save the recording. And in fact, the person who's going to keep it for us and make it available is person I want to introduce first, and she's going to make a brief public service announcement before I introduce our panelists. So I'd like to turn things over for a couple of minutes to Lisa Vallon, who is the Southern Labor Archivist at the Southern Labor Archives, which is at Georgia State University in Atlanta. Go ahead, Lisa.
Thank you so much, and thank you for having me. I wanted to talk briefly about the Southern Labor Archive. We were established in 1971 and are celebrating our 50th anniversary this year. And wanted to talk about how archives can help you both as a union member, but also as a researcher. So first up, as a union member, why archives? We ensure that historically significant records are preserved and made accessible to researchers and to the public and to your community, and not just for 10 years, 50 years. Our goal is hundreds of years to always have it preserved and accessible. And so we serve as society's collective memory. We provide evidence of the past, we promote accountability and transparency, and we help people and organizations understand their history and their role in shaping the past, and we foster a sense of community and identity. And so we can preserve your union records and therefore its history. We have collections across all industries and at all levels, from headquarters, regional offices, districts, and locals. And again, we're happy to accept records from anyone, anywhere in the South. That's kind of our one constraint is you have to be based in the South. And so donating materials to the archive is relatively easy. I try and make it as painless as possible. The first step is to contact me via email. And once I'm done, I'm going to drop a whole bunch of links into the chat, including my email address. And I'm going to ask you about what types of material and the amount that you want to donate. And if you don't know, I can kind of talk you through the process and what we would accept and what we don't accept. But we pretty much accept anything that kind of documented the work that the union does and did. If it's a larger collection, I will come out and I will create an inventory, and I'm going to pack and move the material myself. And while I'm out there, I can also do oral histories. We have a really robust oral history program here at Georgia State, and would love to get you all involved. We found that a great time to donate is when an office is moving or closing, or someone is retiring, or you're just out of storage space. So feel free to contact me. I'm happy to help, happy to talk through the process. And we really do want your records, and you have really important history and stories in your records. So don't think the work you've done is insignificant and not historical. It is. And so for my researchers out there, we preserve the history of workers and unions in the South. And so we have personal papers of labor leaders and activists, the records of labor organizations, and a large collection of oral history recordings. We, again, collect across all industries, but we have some that are heavily prominent in our collections, and that's aviation and other transportation industries, textile and clothing workers, nurses and nursing, and food, retail, and service workers. We're also the national repository for the International Association of Machinists and Aerospace Workers and PATCO. And how you want to access our collections are going to be archive space, which is where all our finding aids are. And finding aids are a tool for accessing and understanding the archival collection. They act as inventories, and they describe the list of contents in the collection and how it's arranged. We have also worked hard to digitize some of our collections, and they can be found in our digital collection. And again, I'll drop those links in just a minute. But just remember, what we have in digital collections is by no means what we have in the archive. We have over 10,000 linear feet, and we keep growing each year. And then I last wanted to shout out for our 50th anniversary. On October 7th at 7 p.m., we are having a conversation with Sarah Burns about her work using archival materials and her documentaries. So we hope to see you all there.
Thank you, Lisa. As someone who has used records found in a closet that were wet and covered in mouse poop. I really would like to echo Lisa's suggestion that you get your organization's records and maybe personal records too, that would be relevant to Lisa, and let her put them somewhere nice and dry. So what I'm going to do now is introduce our panelists very briefly and then explain the format that we're going to use. And then we'll take it from there. So I'm very sorry first to announce that Jermaine Thibodeau, who is one of our panelists, who's an acting assistant professor of African and African American studies at the University of Oklahoma, is sick and unable to attend. So I'm very sorry to announce that, but happy to have our other panelists here. So Dana Caldemeyer, and just wave when I say your name, is an associate professor of history at South Georgia State College. And she's the author of Union Renegades, Miners, Capitalism and Organizing in the Gilded Age. And she's a member of the United Campus Workers of Georgia. Max Krochmal is associate professor of history and founding chair of the Department of Comparative Race and Ethnic Studies at Texas Christian University. He's the author of Blue Texas, The Making of a Multiracial Democratic Coalition in the Civil Rights Era, and co-editor of Civil Rights in Black and Brown, Histories of Resistance and Struggles in Texas, which is coming out this fall. He's a former union staffer, now a community organizer with United Fort Worth and a leader of the TCU chapter of the American Association of University Professors, AUP. Jesse Wilkerson, Wade Jesse, is author of To Live Here, You Have to Fight, How Women Led Appalachian Movements for Social Justice. She holds the Robbins Chair and is Associate Professor of History at West Virginia University. I think I had that backwards on the sign. It's at University of West Virginia, which doesn't exist. She is the granddaughter of Southern Union organizers and was founding member of United Campus Workers of Mississippi. Josh Hollins is a lecturer in US history at University College London, but this year, or coming soon, will be a Fulbright scholar based in Elon College in North Carolina. He's writing a book on the history of homophobic workplace discrimination in the US South and Southwest and the movements that arose to challenge it. And he's a member of the University and Colleges Union at University College London. And then last but not least, we have Phil Laporte, who is retired from the College of Law faculty at Georgia State, and his expertise is in labor arbitration, which he has done for organizations as diverse as the City of Atlanta, AT&T, and Major League Baseball. So here's our format. I have questions that I'm gonna pitch to this gallery of experts, and we're going to let them answer my questions. You can post yours in the chat as we go along as they appeal to you, but we're going to kind of talk among ourselves for about 30 minutes, 40 minutes, and then we're going to turn the floor over to your questions, and I'll either ask them for you, or if we can do it elegantly, we will unmute you and let you speak. But as I learned earlier today, this doesn't always work. So worst comes to worst, you'll type your question in the chat. When you are please use the chat rather than the Q&A. And when you'll see chat right at the bottom of your screen, just click that. You'll see a column. Lots of people are posting it in already. And if your comment is in fact a question and you want me to ask it for you, or you want to ask it, please put a question mark at the beginning of the sentence so I'll be able to identify it. I know this from teaching 300 students at a time. It's very helpful. Okay, so what I've asked our panelists to do to get us started is to very briefly talk to us about their work, and just so that we know who we have in the room and what their interests are. So Dana, I'm going to call on you first.
Hi, my current work, it looks at worker anti-unionism, or just simply non-unionism. Mainly I focus in the Gilded Age and Progressive Era, and specifically I am curious and always trying to find out more about the social and economic reasons for why workers might not join a union, or why they might join but then not follow union orders.
Thanks. Okay, Jesse.
Hey, everybody. My work is largely about how working class women in Appalachia have organized around care work, social reproduction, gender and racial justice, and struggles for the common good. And my first book was about white working class women in Eastern Kentucky coal fields and how they saw liberation movements and the war on poverty as kind of an opening to build political power for poor and working people. I'm now working on a book that reorients the history of the Mountain South around women's lives, and labor is really central to that.
Jesse, can you explain what social reproduction is for those who don't know the term?
Sure, it's everything we do to sustain life. So raising and educating children, feeding ourselves, taking care of each other in our communities.
Okay, thanks. Josh, go ahead.
Yeah, good evening. So I work on the history of homophobic discrimination, workplace discrimination, specifically in the US South and Southwest, and also look at how lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, queer people have organized to counter that discrimination. And I really look at the period from 1970 to the present day, so what we might call, the Sun Belt era, really linking the South and the Southwest. And the book that I'm working on at the moment really focuses on corporations, but I'm currently expanding that to really look at grassroots organizations and really looking at the role of unions in that as well. So I'm looking forward to learning a lot this evening too, and I look forward to the conversation.
Thanks, Josh. Max.
Yeah, hi everyone. Thanks for being here. Max Krochmal. My work looks at the intersections of labor and working class struggles with civil rights movements, with the African American liberation struggle, as well as the long Mexican American Chicano liberation fights and Latino studies broadly. And I'm interested in how different community organizers build power, sort of the grassroots nuts and bolts, and particularly within that around coalition building across lines of difference, across ethnic lines and other intersections. So I wrote a book called Blue Texas that tells that story in an unlikely place, mid 20th century Texas, where Black and brown organizers sort of discovered coalition building as their secret weapon in separate struggles against Jim Crow and Quan Crow. And surprisingly, organized labor discovered, which was white, discovered that they needed the civil rights movements as well, and joined that coalition and helped to push it over the top in critical ways. And of course, we still have lots of that work to do. So they in some ways set a blueprint for us that we're still learning from and working on today.
Thanks. Phil.
Thank you. I spent 30 plus years serving or teaching continuing education classes for union members throughout the state of Georgia. I think I covered all 159 counties, conducting training programs on steward training, grievance handling, labor law, collective bargaining. And I assisted the Southern Labor Archives with some of the oral history interviews, some of the key players in Georgia's labor history, including the Reverend James Orange, Harry Bexley, who was the driving force behind IBEW 613. If you come through downtown Atlanta on the connector, you see the IBEW building to the right. Well, that whole block of buildings was put together by one Harry Bexley, building Local 613 into one of the most important local unions in not only the state of Georgia, but into the entire Southeast. So during that time, I also served as a labor arbitrator. I was appointed by Andrew Young to chair the Atlanta Civil Service Board, appointed to a second term by the late Maynard Jackson, and then serving on a variety of arbitration panels. So, my work has been as an educator and an arbitrator, and I'm happy to be here with all of these distinguished historians and authors tonight.
Thank you. You might be getting some calls at the end of the night, Phil. I think we could use you, especially here. Okay, so I have a question I want to pitch, and as you could already tell, I like to have terms defined, and we have the term organized labor in our title. And so I wonder what you think of that term. As some of you know, I've written about migrant farm workers who are the least unionized, but they could sometimes be pretty darn organized. And so I wonder how you define that term in your own work, or just in your as you teach or as you serve as an activist? Who wants to tackle the question?
I can go first.
All right, Max.
A lot of us work at the margins of what we typically think of as organized labor, right? That there's the House of Labor, right? That supposedly George Meany started, right? And that from the beginning, that was a very exclusive body. And so, you know, even as that has changed and evolved over the 20th century and into the 21st, so much of what, at least I think what many of us study and are involved in is about efforts to broaden what organized labor can mean. To mean, you know, to be sure that the structures of the AFL-CIO and other labor unions, but to even broaden where those unions are organizing, whom they're organizing, what kinds of issues they're tackling. So I guess when I use it, I tend to use it in the traditional sense, right? Labor equals union, bunch of letters, acronyms, you know, the way people normally think of it. But in the histories I write and the struggles in which I engage, it's really about trying to trouble and broaden that and to really build a you know, working class movements for more radical social change, and to do it by understanding the intersections between traditional organized labor and other social movements.
Okay. Jesse, you want to tackle it? I'm curious to know how gender shapes the definitions that you're using.
Yeah, definitely. It's a great question, Cindy. And yeah, I think I'm like Max, that when I use organized labor, I am often thinking of traditional, you know, trade unions. But like Max, in my own work, I don't write that much about trade unions. I mean, I do a little bit with the United Mine Workers of America in Eastern Kentucky, but of course, women at the time I was writing were not members of the UMWA, yet they were organized, and they were often working with unionized miners, but also pushing them in ways that brought to the fore women's issues of caregiving in the coal fields. And they had their own kind of set of demands that centered gender justice. And so, yeah, I take that broader approach and think about working people's movements. The women I write about were involved in the welfare rights campaigns of the National Welfare Rights Organization, which is not a union, but is, I think, we could call it organized labor, probably. And also the Poor People's Campaign was really important for them. So those are working people, they're working collectively for broader social change that would have big impacts for the working class.
So Dana, do your anti-union folks, or are they organized labor of a sort?
That's actually something that I play with in my book a little bit. You know, you have what we classify as organized labor, which is, you know, the House of Labor, where they're very clearly, you know, the names that we recognize today, the AFL, and the time period that I focus on, the AFL-CIO today. You know, we understand these things as, you know, the established groups, but then, you know, on the ground, rank and file don't always recognize those entities as the ones that best represent their interests. And so they're also just as likely to join other organizations. I focus a lot on mining industries. And so organizations like the Progressive Miners of America, they were actually an organization that was a rival union to the United Mine Workers. The United Mine Workers considered them non-union, a complete enemy. But if you were to ask the people who were in those ranks, they would say, no, I'm union. I pay my dues. I'm organized. We're fighting for better working conditions in the mines. And so I think I'm kind of in the same camp with Jesse and Max here, where if I'm teaching in a class, you know, I use the term organized labor to kind of talk about these established structures, but it's a lot more complicated whenever you look on the ground.
And Josh, are the folks that you're writing about working from within traditional unions, or are they outside of them?
Yeah, well, I think Dana's answer to that was really interesting, because I think a lot of the activists that I speak to didn't really come from that organized backgrounds. They actually kind of stumbled upon it. They perhaps you know, were working in places, say like Cracker Barrel, where they weren't organized, or majority of people weren't, say, part of the United Food Workers Unions and stuff just yet. But then when they become discriminated against, then they begin to organize. And I think that's something that we probably see quite often. People, when they're pushed, begin to organize, they begin to question things. And so there's a certain section of people that I researched, that I interviewing and things, who kind of say they stumbled into it. But then at the same time, there's others who are kind of the ones that are organizing them, that I guess are people like those here this evening, who are kind of like, I come from a labor background, organized labor, and kind of using that term is part of their background, and they want to use that to help to further, say, the cause of sexual liberation. And so it's really, I guess, in the middle, or in the intersection of those two kind of definitions, where my work kind of lies.
Okay. Anybody else want to add anything before I move on? Phil?
Well, what comes to mind is someone mentioned trade unions. And, if you think of the building trades, that is probably the most traditional definition of organized labor. And I compare that to the West Virginia public school teachers, and how just organically they said that these working conditions are so unacceptable, so abysmal. We don't need any structure or organization over us. We will take action ourselves to protest and ensure that conditions improve, and that there is better treatment of teachers and enhanced funding for the education of children in West Virginia. So, that organic outpouring of workers committed to a specific issue, a specific goal, they didn't need anybody to tell them what to do. They knew inherently that this could not stand, and they went ahead, organized themselves into protests around a specific issue.
It's interesting that you raised that point, Phil, because the United Campus Workers has been organizing, which is a part of the Communication Workers of America, so that's a traditional definition, but it's been organizing in states where public workers don't have the right of collective bargaining. Right. And so we don't fall under the National Relations Act, which has its limitations, but it also frees us to organize in ways that we might not if we were trying to negotiate a contract, right? So we organize wall to wall with faculty members, grad students and staff, and even undergraduate employees of the universities, all in one union. We call it wall to wall organizing. So it's just interesting how even in this moment, we're just, we're both limited by the definition, but also pushing against it. So, okay, so you guys are, for the most part, pretty modern historians of a modern period, but I'm going to push you out of your comfort zone and ask you how far back you think labor organizing goes in the South, whether you're talking about the traditional definition or the broader definition. When you're teaching about the history of labor, where do you start? You can wave at me when you're ready. Go, Jesse.
Well, I just taught Tara Hunter's book, so I think that's where I'll start with To Joy My Freedom by the wonderful historian Tara Hunter, who writes about washerwomen in Atlanta. So again, it's relevant to you Georgia folks. And I just, teaching it again and rereading it, I was just really struck by Black washerwomen in the 1870s and the coalition building that they did with railroad workers, workers on the wharfs in construction. And then you had washerwomen joining them, and the kinds of demands they were making for higher wages and also for dignified work. and fighting against white supremacy. And that organizing was happening in Galveston, Texas. It was happening in Jackson, Mississippi, and Atlanta, and probably other places that we don't know about because the records didn't survive, right? Tara Hunter pieced that together with what she could gather. And so, that goes back to just after the Civil War. We could probably push it back further. I'll leave it to one of my colleagues to do that.
I can go next and say that, yeah, I go earlier when given the opportunity. And yeah, I like to think about obviously enslaved people who, engaged in all sorts of workplace actions that were also, of course, bound up in their own liberation and in challenging the stereotypes and the racism that was part of that racialized system of enslavement. So, wonderful work by Tavolia Glimpf and others that about how even within the plantation household, it was such contested terrain in which enslaved Black women, successfully challenged and renegotiated the terms of their labor with white plantation mistresses. So that's another example. It's a great question, Cindy, because I think, we can keep pushing further and further back, right? And of course we have, Marcus Rediker and others working on merchant seamen in the colonial period. And we could talk about how that had a particularly Southern variant in places like New Orleans or Charleston. But gosh, that sounds like an area we need even more research on. I'm intrigued by the question.
I was thinking as Jesse was talking about W.E.B. Du Bois, who talked about the Civil War as a general strike, right? People freeing themselves in the midst of the war. And so that raises a question. If we have this really broad definition of what organizing is and we push it back in time, it raises the question of what there are sources for. So this might be a question for Lisa. And where are the silences in the archive? What things are we not uncovering simply because the records aren't there? Because of what maybe past archives thought were important, or just simply that some people didn't leave records that made it into an archive and so forth. Could you address that, Lisa?
Yeah, definitely. So at the Southern Labor Archives, we don't have anything that really any earlier than 1888, which was when what would become the International Association of Machinists was founded here in Atlanta. They tend to be our earliest records that we have. We also, from the early 1900s, have a fair amount of textile workers from the Carolinas and Tennessee. But the bulk of our collections don't really start until post-World War II. And I don't know if it might be a combination of things. There was, especially in the South with the Civil War, a lot of destruction and the burning of Atlanta. And I think that definitely attributed to loss. And then also the hostility of the South to organizing and the right to work and all of that. A good example here in the archive is the 1934 textile workers strike. We have an amazing oral history collection from a 1990s documentary, but we don't actually have a lot of physical documents related to that strike. And a lot of, especially our earlier documents, to focus on white men. Mm-hmm. Just because historically that has been what has been valued, those stories. And so we're working on trying to diversify and collecting more stories in different communities. But yeah, especially when you're going back to the late 1800s, early 1900s, that's going to be a lot of what you find. And I think it's just a combination of those were the people who had the means to preserve their records and work with institutions to get them in. And were able also to document with paper and had all of these resources to document their history. Mm-hmm. I think that also plays a part in it.
So Josh, you're actually kind of having to create an archive to do this in a way.
Yeah, well, I'm glad that you called on me because, you know, all of the things that Lisa was mentioning there were really hitting home with me because, you know, I set out when I was doing my PhD research, I really wanted to write, you know, a history of like Southern queer labor organizing, right? And the archives just aren't there, you know. And so really going around and to different archives, so the Atlanta History Center, to Georgia State University as well, and using the Women and Genders collection as well as the Southern Labor collections to piece together bits all across the country, and then to try to flesh that out with interviews and oral histories and things. But it really did leave quite a gap in my research, and this is one of the things why I'm quite excited to be working on this book now, to try to really flesh that out, because as Lisa was saying, you know, if you rely so heavily on archives, then you really are kind of reiterating the history of the people who had the means, who had the foresight to write that down. And that does happen to be, you know, it tends to be middle to upper class folks who have something that they want to leave behind and a record that they want to show. And I think one of the things that you know, is quite exciting about an event like this is where we can really link people up to kind of say, you know, it would be really great for historians to talk to activists. And of course, many of us are historians and activists and labor organizers as well. But I think it's really important. And just to go back to an earlier point about kind of where do we begin here, because I was remembering teaching the WPA ex-slave narratives to understand the Great Depression, which is by Stephanie Shaw, and kind of using some of those sources to kind of question, you know, make students think about, you know, where do we place the start of, say, Southern history, let alone Southern labor history, right? And I think that's a good thing for us to think about as well, that actually, you know, for my research, which looks at the last 50 years, we can begin to kind of challenge even, you know, the narratives that are quite recent as well.
I would also want to quickly, again, give myself a shout out of one of the ways we can stop these silences is to work with communities, for me to come to events like this and appeal to you all that please consider donating your records to the archive. We really want to preserve your stories and your voices and your diverse viewpoints. And this is one of the ways to do that and to make it accessible to future researchers and to tell your stories.
So I was raised in Canada, so I didn't study US history when I was a kid at all, but I would guess that most people who have, you know, the just generic US history class that you're required to do at least once or twice, K through 12, if you learn about labor history, it would probably be about the late 19th century, right? The great upheaval and pitched battles between strikers and strike breakers and a growing socialist party. They probably leave that part out, and so forth. So I wonder how the South fits into the stories that we've told about the labor movement. Is it outside of it? Is it a part of it, but different? How do you teach it? How do you think about it? Or how was it done to you when you were a student? Phil, you want to tackle that one?
Well, I think we looked to Bread and Roses in Lawrence, Massachusetts. We look at the Haymarket in Chicago, but there wasn't much mention of activities in Atlanta. You know, and one of the things that occurs to me is Daniel Blackman's book, Slavery by Another Name. And boy, what that revealed. He came out and spoke to AFSCME Local 1644 in a program I organized a long time ago now, primarily an African-American local representing workers at the City of Atlanta, the Atlanta School Board, and Grady Hospital. And his audience was paying rapt attention. Blackman, a former reporter for the Wall Street Journal. But what he uncovered about the system that went on with African-American men who were doing nothing more than walking down the street, who would be arrested for loitering and then brought to court, and they would be charged with court costs and fines. And if they didn't have the money, then they would become an indentured servant and literally rented out to companies like the Georgia Power Company and Chattahoochee Brick Company. And that land, the Chattahoochee Brick Company, a railroad wants to buy it now. Well, it's an unmarked grave of many of those workers who were literally worked to death. So there's ongoing struggle there. But no, those type of issues weren't addressed in the regular curriculum of K through 12 in the United States. You might have heard something about John L. Lewis, maybe Walter Reuther, but again, talk about old white men, right?
Right. I'm just amazed that you can remember all the acronyms for the labor unions, Phil. I can't even remember the number of my own union local, so it's just very impressive. Jesse, I'm going to come to you.
Yeah, so first of all, growing up in East Tennessee, I didn't learn anything about labor, not even from my own family that was involved in labor organizing until adulthood. But I did want to mention, this is, we're at the anniversary of the Battle of Blair Mountain, which just happened. And there's been these amazing celebrations and historic events, public history events across the state of West Virginia to commemorate the Battle of Blair Mountain. And the Battle of Blair Mountain was the culmination of the mine wars, which had happened over about a decade and a half, when miners were organizing against the mine guard system, so the surveillance and policing system. They were organizing around housing issues, low pay, and a lack of any sort of power. And Black, white, and immigrant miners joined forces to battle the coal operators in this battle of Blair Mountain. Federal troops were called in to put down the labor uprising of these workers. And so it's also a tragic event. And then I think related to this question is that the Battle of Blair Mountain and that history of the mine wars was suppressed for decades afterward. The political elite controlled by the coal operators in West Virginia didn't allow this history to be taught. And so it's really significant that people organized across the state. There's now a Mine Wars Museum, and there were these series of events, and those will keep occurring, I think, for coming weeks. They also wanted to mention Joe Trotter's work, because I think, while Battle of Blair Mountain is really significant and we should remember it and recover that history, sometimes there's a real emphasis on the interracial solidarity of that movement or that event, and that is significant because it was happening in Jim Crow, West Virginia. It was a Jim Crow state, but it also meant that coalition was really fragile. And so after the defeat of that movement, Black workers continued to organize, and they did so in all sorts of ways, through mutual aid societies, fraternal orders, through their churches, through the NAACP. And Joe Trotter really tracks that in his book, Coal, Class, and Color. So I think it's a really layered and complex story about interracial solidarity, but also about the Black working class and what we were talking about with organized labor and how people organize in various ways by joining unions, but also outside of unions.
Thanks. Max.
Maybe Dana first, just to start with the Knights.
Okay, we'll go in chronological order. Dana.
Because I actually want to talk about the Knights too, but I think you can give us the overview.
Okay, go ahead.
Yeah, I wanted to mention a little bit about the Knights of Labor. Normally whenever we think about the Knights, we think about them organizing in northern cities, and we think about things like Haymarket and things like that. But the Knights were actually very active throughout the South in the Gilded Age. And I think that's something that's often overlooked in histories that are taught to, obviously, grade school students and high school students just because they don't get much labor history at all. But I think that often gets overlooked in college history classes too. These were often very small locals, and they were often really autonomous. So that means that they didn't really have a national place to send all their records to. They just kind of kept everything locally. And I've kind of bounced around from archive to archive for years now, trying to find Knights of Labor records from, their minutes from their meetings in the 1880s. And they're really hard to find. But whenever you find them, they're written on just like random scraps of whatever paper they had handy. And so they don't hold up well. And it's really hard for those things to find their way to archives. But they did exist. We do know that those locals exist. They're actual books that have records of all of these locals. So we know that they exist. We just don't know all that they talked about. We don't know all that they did. And there were other organizations that were organizing at this exact same time. The Knights are the most well-known, but all kinds of miners' organizations, really different groups of workers are all trying to organize in the South during this time period. But I suspect they're running into the same problem with just being able to keep their records on paper and things like that.
Thanks. Okay, Max, go ahead.
Yeah, thank you. That's great. Yeah, so the Knights of Labor, had a strong presence in Texas as well. It's a story that, none of my students have ever heard. To Jesse's point, I think so many of these stories have been repressed, right, because of unions busted and lives shattered, and of course the right-wing dominance of the region. But yeah, we had the Knights of Labor even in sort of the mythic parts of Texas, right? So there were Knights of Labor cowboy locals that went on strike in 1883. The Great Southwest Strike had an epicenter in Texas, and some 5,000 workers that were on strike here. And in fact, I live maybe a mile away from the site of the Battle of Buttermilk Switch, right, which is much less well known, but was a pitched gun battle in which the strikers, were able to successfully fend off, a posse of so-called lawmen, and including some of the sort of mythic Texas gunmen, right, that were there trying to bring scabs into town and break the strike, and the strikers beat them back, right? And so these stories are here, and in some ways they're kind of hidden in plain sight. We don't have markers, we don't commemorate them. And then the other one I wanted to mention is a group that we don't often put into labor history at all, but for me it's so foundational, which are small farmers, tenants, sharecroppers. In the 1880s in Texas, they formed a mass movement that ultimately became the Farmers Alliance and helped to give birth to the People's Party, the greatest third party challenge really to corporate capitalism we've seen in so many ways. And, I'm a student of Larry Goodwin's, among others, a great chronicler of Texas and Southern populism. But, this was a mass movement, and we don't consider farmers workers, right, because of various industrial centered definitions that have come from the state primarily, but also because of how they organized. And the Farmers Alliance tried to form connections with the Knights of Labor with varying degrees of success. But they, as Jesse invoked, they were able to cross racial lines in somewhat tentative and halting ways, but sometimes successfully. And they represented a real challenge to the imposition of, the Southern order of the late 19th and early 20th century, the creation of Jim Crow. And so this was a mass movement of ordinary people. And again, it started just down the road from where I live too, maybe 30 miles in Cleburne, Texas. So, these are the kinds of stories that I think it's so important to teach and to share, and that they upset in some ways, like the normal chronologies of US history, right? That, for example, that Reconstruction was still contested for a generation after the federal troops pulled out. And that's when you are viewing it from the angle of working class struggles, it forces you to kind of maybe step back and see things that are thought to have been settled, but in fact were not. And that's a liberatory conclusion, right? Because it means that ordinary people in even these desperate times that we're in now can come together and organize and really challenge the status quo in ways that have durable legacies as well.
So Nell Levin in the chat asked about IWW activity, which reminded me of Mac Marquis' work, the dissertation student of mine who's at William and Mary in Virginia, who's writing about the Brotherhood of Timber Workers, which had 20,000 members around the turn of the 20th century. And they affiliate, or they want to affiliate with the Industrial Workers of the World, the IWW, which is the most sort of radical game going, right, in the country at the time. And the IWW is an interracial union and said, you have to set aside white supremacy if you're going to do it. And they don't necessarily do that personally, but they do it officially. And the Brotherhood of Timber Workers becomes an interracial union. And you've all been talking about interracial movements. So I want to get at this issue. How much does white supremacy divide workers and kind of impede union organization in the South? Does it make the South exceptional, or has that been a misunderstanding, that since we know that there was white supremacy in lots of places in the US, are we wrong to think of this as a especially Southern story? Dana, how about you? I see you thinking there.
I was just about to volunteer, so it's great. I want to kind of go in the middle there a little bit. Obviously, the South has, is known for Jim Crow issues and everything, and so I do think that there is a special kind of struggle that you see in the South, but at the same time, you see the struggles that unions face with interracial activity all throughout the United States. I focus on the Gilded Age, and the mining unions that I focus on pretty much overwhelmingly said that they were going to be interracial. They didn't want to have anybody cast out from the union because that would really work against their interests, but that was on paper. Mm-hmm. And so it always looks so much nicer on paper, but whenever it comes to actually implementing it, that becomes one of the really big roadblocks. I've seen records in Northern Illinois where white miners just completely threw a fit at the idea of their local being run by a Black man, even though he had been working in the industry for a really long time. He was very skilled, he was very respected, but because he was Black, he could not have this place of authority. And that's supposed to be in Northern Illinois. And of course, these conversations are being held elsewhere, in the South. There was a Black mine organizer who was moving through West Virginia in the 1890s, and he was forced to be separated from the white union workers he was traveling with. And there were nights whenever he was scared to death. He thought he wasn't going to live. But I think whenever you look at these stories, it's not just something that's a Southern story. You definitely see these things throughout the United States. And this is something that Black workers recognized, and they held their unions accountable for it. So it does become a roadblock for union organizing. And it becomes, at least in my work, something that would cause workers to kind of say, wait, I don't know if I really want to pay dues to you because you're actually doing stuff that's hurting me right now. You're upholding Jim Crow. You're not doing anything about this. You're paying lip service, but that's it. And so I think that is something that you see on a national level, but it's a lot more loud possibly in the US South.
Okay. So we know that much of our labor law, collective bargaining rights, the minimum wage, the 40-hour work week, child labor laws were passed in the 1930s as part of the New Deal. But there are two main groups left out of that compact, right? Farm workers and domestic workers are completely excluded from those measures. And so I wonder if anybody can address what you think the effects of that were. We could also, Jesse, I'm thinking too of how the Social Security system, born in the same era, sort of valorized men's labor over unpaid women's labor, right? You get your Social Security pension through the paid work you do. And so women got their pension through their husbands, but not, so there's a gender dimension too, in terms of who sort of gets left out of the New Deal. And I wonder what you think the implications of those things are. Anybody want to tackle? I'm going to put this on the quiz at the end then. Definitely.
Okay. I can start, but I want to hear Jesse's response. So I can call on Jesse. No,
I'll go.
Okay.
Yeah, it's a great question, Cindy. And what it makes me think about from my own work is the welfare rights movement, and in particular, the welfare rights movement in Appalachia, which I think surprises people that the welfare rights movement in West Virginia, Eastern Kentucky, Southwest Virginia was attractive to widowed white women and single white women, African-American women in the region, and also workers with disabilities. They all joined as part of the welfare rights movement. And I think one thing that history gets at is the limitations of New Deal legislation and who was left out, and who was prioritized in what we might call, or what scholars have called breadwinner liberalism. So this emphasis on the family wage, that able-bodied men will be the workers providing for family, and Social Security will kind of flow through them and their families. And that leaves out Black families, in large part because they can't sustain the same kinds of relationships for all kinds of structural reasons, and also single women with children. And so the welfare rights movement is exposing that in a lot of ways, and then arguing and organizing around this idea that their work is actually really valuable, and that the welfare state should be reorganized to guarantee them wages, regardless of their relationship to a man, or regardless of what race they are. So that's where my mind goes. Thanks. Max.
Yeah, thanks. That's great, Jesse. Yeah, so maybe to go back earlier then, the 30s and 40s, and even the previous question, right? Like the nation was founded on white supremacy, right? And on low wage labor. That's sort of the whole project, right? And conquest. And so when we get to the New Deal era, right? Obviously there's a crisis. There's an attempt to sort of save the system. But the power of the Southern lobby in Congress and the committee appointments, as well as the Southwestern agricultural lobby, right, means that agriculture gets excluded. And it's not an accident. It's the direct targeting of Black and Latino and other people of color labor, right? And it achieves, along with the gendered exclusions, the desired effects where over 80% of Black women are excluded from the key provisions of the New Deal state, right? Be that Social Security and aid to dependent children, or of course, coverage by the National Labor Relations Act. So because the labor movement forms in so many ways that the CIO upsurge ends up directing itself right toward the sectors that are protected by this New Deal labor regime, it's sort of by definition exclusionary, right? Because agricultural labor is left out, because women are largely left out. And so, I'm working on a project now with a number of folks on this call where we're trying to think about how does it, if you put agricultural workers in this period and food workers in this period at the center of the story, first off, what you see is an incredibly diverse group of workers from all over the nation who are trying to break open the New Deal labor state, right? And to get coverage under these laws, and that's directly linked to their assault on white supremacy, and to some extent on patriarchy as well. And the stakes were really high, right? So that coming out of World War II, the progressive elements of labor, the people that Bob Korstad writes about in his book, right? The people that Robin Kelly and Michael Honey and others, where there are strong interracial CIO unions in the South, they've come to realize that their only hope, I mean, really as early as 38, but certainly after the war, right? Their only hope is to break open the sort of Southern oligarchy that has run the region by organizing at the work site and by organizing in electoral politics. And finally, the AFL-CIO realizes, oh yeah, we should do this with Operation Dixie after the war, but it ends up not working. It's not enough. It fails for a bunch of different reasons. So yeah, I think that's the key question: who's in and who's out. And in some ways, it's striking how organized labor, even though there was this upsurge that was much broader, is sort of forced into a very narrow pathway of what is provided under this legal regime. And it's I think we're still, in some ways, right, we're still suffering the consequences of that narrow redirection. Yeah, I'll stop there.
Okay, so let's follow up with a question about how diverse the labor movement. Oh, sorry, Phil, I'll come back to you. How diverse the labor movement has been in the South. I mean, so I was given a talk last year about labor history in Georgia, and I started with a slave revolt waged by Native Americans in the Spanish colony in Georgia. So I went way back. But we tend to talk about Black and white people in the South. But if we broaden out from that, what does our labor movement look like? Thinking of a place like Houston, which is the most diverse city in the country now, right? So how should we be talking about the labor movement outside that Black-white binary? Max, I was thinking of coming back to you here.
All right, I feel like I'm saying a lot. Well, yeah, sure. It is that I would say that, America has always been a lot more diverse than Black and white, and our histories are still playing catch up in terms of understanding race and ethnicity in sort of more multi-ethnic and comparative and relational terms. Sure. So, if we look at Houston, we have, I'm trying to, you asked a lot of questions. I'm trying to figure out how to best answer. But I'll say this, right, that over time, labor does become in the South, in Houston and Texas, because of the industries where it's focused, it's kind of added on top of a racial division of labor that is already segmented, right? So by the time that the CIO has its upsurge, there are Black jobs, there are white jobs, there are male jobs, there are female jobs, there are Mexican jobs. And so to get to what Dana said earlier, the first question for workers of color was always whether the organizations were willing to challenge that division of labor or not, or how far they were willing to challenge it, because it was always somewhere in between. And so, yeah, I think, moving sort of beyond the binary for Latinos in the South, there was all sorts of questions about how the color line would apply to them in various specific local ways, because of the power of sort of Jim Crow as an organizing schema. Yeah, I'll stop.
Okay, so Phil, I'm coming to you, and I want to know about what you think are the main impediments to organizing today. And we don't have too much time, but I'm interested in any of you who have thoughts about that. Are these the same impediments as before, or are things fundamentally different now?
Well, I was all ginned up to talk about the New Deal and St. Francis Perkins and what she brought to the table to FDR.
Okay, you guys say she was though, Phil. You guys say she is.
FDR could do is count votes, and he had great political operatives. Tommy Corcoran and Harry Hopkins knew that the New Deal legislation would never get through the Senate unless he provided some compromises to the Southern senators. And part of that is the carving out of domestic workers and farm workers. You compare that to Minnesota, which established a political party called the Democratic Farmer Labor Party. And if you look at the 1948 Democratic Convention, when Hubert Humphrey said it's time to come out of the shadows of states' rights into the bright, warm sunshine of civil rights, Strom Thurmond led the entire South Carolina delegation out and formed the Dixiecrat Party. So politics is important and it's critical. In the South, you had some progress. The name of E.L. Abercrombie should be brought up. Mr. Abbey was a very slight man. His records are at the Southern Archives. Mr. Abbey was the business manager for the Laundry Workers Union in Atlanta. He is the one that had the courage to integrate that local union. He took the Black seniority list and the white seniority list, and he integrated it. And he told all the members that this is what we're going to do. It's because it's the right thing to do. And Abbey showed other labor leaders that was the time in which to move forward. Impediments to organizing today, there is still this righteous indignation in Southern culture that if you want to be successful, if you want to be seen as a decent human being, that you have to be anti-labor. South Carolina professor, the late Hoyt Wheeler, was interviewed by the New York Times, and he said all of his graduate students in the industrial relations program at the University of South Carolina said that in order to be accepted in polite society, that you had to be anti-labor. When there was a bill in the Georgia General Assembly to establish collective bargaining rights for public sector workers, John Sweeney came down and testified in favor of it. Stuart Acuff led that effort. It was described by opponents as, quote, godless communism. We cannot let our Southern values be eroded by this communistic theory of workers joining together to bargain to improve their lives. So culturally, there's still this notion that somehow organizing workers and giving them a voice is going to erode polite society in the South. More than you wanted to know, I'm sure.
No, thank you. That was really helpful. So I might come back to you guys later, but I want to open the floor to some of the questions that are in the chat. So let me remind people, if you want to put a question in the chat that you want us to address, to put a question mark in the front of it so I'll see it. Alexa Sparks, I think we've answered your question, so you can put another one down in the chat if we haven't. And Rochelle, I think we've tackled yours too, but let's look at Judy's question. She says, in the movements you studied, have you run across any particularly interesting or successful strategies for maintaining organizing strength and vitality over multiple generations? Which is a really interesting question, because I know that some of the hardest things is to sustain an organizing culture, right, over a long period of time. Any tips from the past or present for that matter? Go ahead, Jessie.
Yeah, so one thing that I've always been struck by in writing about families in the coal fields is how in oral history interviews, they talk about hearing stories about labor struggles and unions around the dinner table. And I think that storytelling was really important for, at least in the coal fields and with UMWA, which was strong over several generations. I think that's why you probably saw the repression in keeping these stories out of textbooks. But that kind of, and I recall Eula McGill, who was this amazing textile worker and labor organizer, also discussing how her mother, when she was a child, her mother took her to a Labor Day parade or some kind of labor parade, and that she would hear stories about labor struggles. And so I think, to me, like, some of the work has to happen at that community level of people telling their stories and talking about what it meant to them to be in a union. I mentioned my own family not really talking about that history. I think because of anti-communism, because Tennessee became so anti-union. And then when I did finally ask my grandmother about it, she had boxes of stuff, and it had been the most important thing in her life. And she just felt like she couldn't really talk about it. So again, a shout out to the archives and collecting those kinds of stories as well, that help families, connect to their history. I know at the Southern Oral History program, I remember family members of textile workers would call sometimes. They would find, online, they would find their family members' interview and reconnect to that history. So I think all of that is important, along with kind of public memorials and public history and commemorations.
Okay, anybody else?
I could say quickly in terms of strategies, some of the folks that I have written about were able to kind of bring forward a rather broad vision for organizing around economic justice and racial justice and they were able to do it in a whole lot of different contexts. So some amount of flexibility, I think, it would be the strategy, right? That organizations can come and go, they can be crushed, but organizers can find their way into different sorts of alliances and coalitions, even, you know, in the depths of the Cold War in Houston, right? Where this particular guy I'm thinking about, you know, was a Black man who organized a segregated auxiliary of a railroad brotherhood, and then helped to build a sort of leftist movements and the labor movement and the Progressive Party. And after that was all crushed, right, they formed a series of new organizations that were sort of neighborhood based, and that, you know, allowed them to redirect their work into new channels. And then, of course, I write a lot about coalition building as that sort of secret weapon that, you know, that there are often possibilities in terms of crossing lines of difference, where in the end you end up having somewhat more in common with people who are seem very different from you, but maybe superficially, but then you know, underneath, they through the process of working together, folks discover some commonalities.
And
Go ahead,
so
Phil, briefly.
there are a couple of thoughts. One of the building trades have a very long tradition of passing along the skills and opportunities in the apprenticeship training programs to sons and daughters who would gravitate towards following their parent into that trade. So that's one way intergenerationally it passed on, that you better work a union job if you want to be safe on the job and earn enough to pay the mortgage and have health care. The UAW in their Family Education Center, they have a robust program where they invite the entire family to participate in the education center at Black Lake. And they had regional programs as well. And so they would invest in taking the entire family and exposing them to the culture of the union. And the UAW and the Ruther brothers in particular envisioned that the UAW and the labor movement would become a greater social movement. The steelworkers had a similar program here in the Southeast. So that passing on of the benefits of working union and having a voice at work, I think helped a great deal in terms of passing that message of the benefits of unionization intergenerationally.
It's interesting that you said that, because I think the downside of that sort of legacy membership where you followed your dad right into the union is that it kept many unions all white, right? That you excluded other folks, they didn't get that privilege of joining. But the other thing that you mentioned, I think, is also really important, that the union just wasn't just in the workplace, that it was also in the community. And one of the best places to see that in the South is in Ybor City, and I'm typing the name of it here, which is a neighborhood in Tampa where all these cigar workers from Cuba, from Italy, from various places in Europe and Latin America would come there to be cigar workers. But they were union members and often socialists and anarchists, but not just on the job. You know, they build these buildings that are still there, these opera halls, and where you would go to hear lectures. They built hospitals where you paid a little fee and then you got to go to the hospital for free. It's an amazing place to visit, and you can get a tour and go see it. So that extending what it means to be a union member into the community, into the family, I think is so key, and we've often lost that in the present. So we have some questions here. Broderick has a question that I don't know if we can answer, so I'm just going to about whether anybody's organizing around bringing a public employees labor relations board to Georgia, which is an awfully good idea. And is anyone familiar with Roscoe Proctor? So I'm going to suggest that people answer that in the chat if they know the answers. But there's a question here from Alexa on how we as scholars interact with people or oral histories of labor history in constructing our narratives. How much can be gained by the cooperation of folklore and Southern studies with labor history? So I wonder who can address that. So where does oral history come in? Josh, you want to talk about that since it's what you're doing?
I mean, I'm very much at the start of my project, which is going to interview Cracker Barrel workers across the South, but also the Midwest, because I think what's quite interesting is that Cracker Barrel, the roadside chain, purposely, when it expanded during the 1990s, moved into the Midwest and said, these are Southern people too. They have Southern values, right? And so, we've talked a bit this evening about challenging those kind of notions as well, as about, is the South exceptional in this way? And I think Dana and others have quite rightly said it isn't. But I'm very much at the start of this project, and so I'd be quite interested to hear from Jesse and others, not to be on the spot, Jesse, who have worked with the Southern Oral History Project, which I'm really looking forward to using very soon as well.
Before we get to Jesse, can you just explain why Cracker Barrel, Josh? Because I know the answer, but I'm not sure everybody.
Yeah,
here
sorry,
does.
I should say. So my work started off by looking at homophobic workplace discrimination. And so in the 1990s, Cracker Barrel becomes one of the first companies to explicitly discriminate against lesbian and gay men. And they say, we're going to fire 20 workers because they are lesbian and gay. They don't uphold family values. And so that's what kind of got me interested. And it's something that I'm hoping to publish soon. But then I realized that there's a bigger story here, that they're not just discriminating against LGBT people in the 1990s, they're also discriminating against African Americans and Latinos. And so the project is really expanding out now to kind of think about, well, how does Cracker Barrel sell itself as Southern nostalgia, and what are the practices that they're perpetrating way up until the 2000s, where it's 2004, they're sued by the NAACP for serving African-American customers food out of the trash, for segregating their restaurants and things. And so I'm interested in exploring discrimination, but also what that meant for the workers as well.
Thanks.
Joshua,
And-
if I can just mention quickly, there was a case here in Georgia with Cracker Barrel that Congressman Barney Frank came down from Massachusetts, held a press conference that got all sorts of media attention. So if that's your area of work, I would make it a point to track down that media coverage and see if you can score an interview with Barney Frank.
Yeah, thanks, Philip. I'll follow up with you as well on that too. Atlanta became quite a hub for it.
Josh, you have a question in the chat that I'm going to let you answer. Jesse, go ahead.
Yeah, so it's a great question about oral histories and labor history. I don't want to speak for Max, but I think we're on the same page that it's been really fundamental for the kind of work that we do. The archives that I used didn't really have much about working class women in Appalachia, and I went to almost all the archives that I could go to figure out how to tell their story. And so oral histories that I did, but also that other people did and then archived, were really fundamental to that work. And so, my process was kind of going between the oral history interviews and then the paper trail in the archives and reading between the lines in what was happening in the so-called official records and telling a more nuanced story. And I'll say another part of the process for me was sharing my interpretations and the narrative that I was writing with the interviewees, which maybe seems like, why would you do that? It's going to add all this time. It does lead to a lot of back and forth, but was really important to do if I'm trying to represent accurately working people's lives and their experiences in these movements. So, I would say that's another piece of this that we don't always talk about, our responsibility to the narrators and the kind of work that goes into that.
So we have a question here from Barbara Joy from a little bit back about where she asked what the influence of real rather than stereotyped communist and socialist organizers was in Southern labor history. Anyone want to tackle it? of Mind Mel in the South or Robin Kelly's book, Dana Calamar?
Well, I can talk a little bit about some of the organizing that's done with individuals like Mother Jones, who was extremely, like, she was a force in organizing the miners and in the coal fields throughout the United States. And so I think you can see a lot of tried and true socialism in the labor organizing movement. But I think that it is also something that gets that companies use to their advantage to kind of say, oh, these guys are radicals, they're dangerous, and so I think that it does. Sometimes they get used almost as like a red herring, but there is a lot of activism among socialists, and they are extremely involved. They're among the most dedicated in the union, and so they're the force that's always there. Whereas a lot of the other workers, they kind of fade in and out as on whether or not they see the union as necessary. At least in my work, if the union seems useful, then they'll join, and if the union doesn't seem useful, then they still might like the vision that the union represents, but they won't necessarily pay their dues or fall in line with all the orders. But your socialists, they're there for the long haul in a lot of cases. And so they play a really important role in labor organizing, because you don't get a movement unless you have people who are there to build up the movement to get it going in the first place.
Okay.
I'm reminded of John L. Lewis's quote. And Lewis said, when you're in a ferocious battle, you make arrows out of any wood. And he said that the socialists and the communists were his best organizers, most dedicated organizers. So to echo your point, Dana, that he said that they were devoted, consistent, his best organizers.
Yeah, and if I could add, right, it's tricky because it is such a boogeyman, right? And people are secretive about it often. But right, we see in our history at work on the Cannery and Packing House Workers Union that the people who were members of the Communist Party made a huge difference to building the movement in the South and nationwide. They were very committed anti-racists, and we've seen that again in Robin Kelly's work and others. Their defense in Scottsboro, their work among Mexicanos in the Southwest, and other Latinos elsewhere, really did open up the labor movement in really powerful ways. And they were really great organizers, as Phil said, in just a technical sense, very often. That wasn't uncomplicated. It did expose them to other political vulnerabilities as a movement and as individuals. And then, more broadly, the radicals in the South have made a huge difference when they've engaged in sort of popular front strategies, broad-based organizing strategies in which, sure, they might be building the Socialist Party or some other organization, but they see their work as really embedding themselves in local communities and trying to build power in those places. So we talked before about the Brotherhood of Timber Workers. There's strong socialist influence there, as well as anarchists. Of course, the Wobblies. There's a great book called Grassroots Socialism by Jim Green that I've thought about a couple times tonight, that talks about socialists in Texas, Louisiana, Arkansas, and Oklahoma, the old Southwest. So I'd urge people to check that out as one starting point. But yeah, there's a radical tradition in the South, and it's actually mostly organic radicalism. It's local people, it's Southerners, Black, white, and other, who've done it, and they haven't taken orders from New York or Moscow or anywhere else, but rather that they've come to see sort of radical class analysis as part and parcel of their own experience, and so they've embraced it and shared it with their neighbors and friends and coworkers.
So we have a little bit more time, but I'm watching the clock, and I'm thinking that it would be fun if people put other questions in the chat that we might not get to today, but if we do this again, we'd be able to sort of think ahead. So feel free to keep adding questions, even if we don't get to them. But there's a really interesting question here from Patrick Sheridan, who says, we've been talking about the South as a whole and whether it has a different attitude toward organized labor than other parts of the country. And he's wondering if perhaps there were different regions within the South that had different attitudes or approaches to organized labor. So anyone want to tackle that? I thought that was a really fascinating question. Upper South, Lower South, Deep South. Certainly, we've had lots of studies on these very diverse places like Tampa and New Orleans that are on the sort of on the edge, right? These port cities that were so much more diverse in many ways than other places. But is there an Appalachian style of organizing, Jesse?
Oh yeah, absolutely. I mean, Appalachian history is really labor history. Much of the historiography is about labor. And that has to do with resource extraction in the region and the exploitation of workers. And although I will say, when I say Appalachia right now, I'm talking about the coal fields in central Appalachia. I'm from East Tennessee, where there's not a strong union tradition like there is in Eastern Kentucky and West Virginia. So even within Appalachia, we would have to kind of break it down. And that has to do, with various reasons, but partly because of the dominance of coal and the single economy that developed there. And so I think it was really clear for workers to know who the enemy was and what it looked like to organize against that enemy. And maybe that's, it's a little more difficult in more diverse economies.
Okay. So we have a great question from Alexis Sparks, and we're going to close on it. And she asks what we hope to achieve in exploring and publicizing the narratives that you all write about. Is your goal to inspire future organizers? What is the purpose of labor history in your opinion, she says. Can't think of a better closing question than that one. Dana, what do you think?
Well, one of the reasons why I started working on this project of investigating anti-unionism was to kind of figure out how we got to where we are today, where we have a whole bunch of workers in our current workforce that aren't in the union. And I wanted to kind of see, how long this legacy lasted. I found some commonalities among labor organizer reports in the 19th century, them complaining about workers just not wanting to stay faithful to the union. And it seemed very similar to what we were wrestling with today. And so I wanted to see if I could find any of these common underlying factors to, try to figure out what we can do to go forward. And so that's really what my work is about, trying to figure out what went wrong back then, what went right back then, so that we can try to figure out where to go now.
So Josh, you're sitting in London, you're in grad school. Why in heaven's name do you think I'm going to write about workers in a Cracker Barrel in the South?
Well, I mean, I'm a labor organizer. I come from a labor background, and so I was already interested in that question, and I'm gay, so I'm also interested in questions of homophobia. And I think to some extent I did stumble into the southern kind of region, and I feel very much like a carpetbagger radical coming to, I'm learning so much from you all. But one of the things that appeals to me is that, these aren't just regional questions, as people have said tonight. If the South seemed exceptional at one point, in fact, it seems more emblematic of the United States now, if you think about the spread of right to work laws. And, for what I'm interested in, the holdouts in terms of anti-sodomy laws and things, and how they became battlegrounds. And actually, I think it speaks to an international question, where we think about class and we think about workplace organization and what should unions be doing and what should we as working people be doing. And I think, the issues from the past to now are similar in some ways, and we can learn lessons. And one of the big takeaways for me is, the needs really, steps towards equality help. And we have to remember that, an injury to one is an injury to all, and there's lots of big issues going on now, but really a need for a broad-based kind of expansive vision for tackling these issues. And I think, as everyone has kind of touched upon to some extent tonight, if we go from the marginalized inwards, then we can start to see perhaps some of the strategies that we didn't see from that old house of labor that we were talking about earlier.
Thank you. So Lisa, you collect this stuff, you stick them in boxes, you shove it in a vault. What do you hope all that's for when you're doing that work? What do you see as the uses of a labor archive?
I see the uses in a couple of different ways. One thing that I've seen over and over again with undergraduate students and researchers and community members coming into the archive and using our collections is they had no idea about any of this. One of our heavily used collections that I mentioned earlier, the Uprising of 34, it's not taught in school that there was this massive textile worker strike in 1934. People died, the National Guard was called up. It was monumental and impacted labor organizing in the South for generations. And it's not taught, no one knows about it. And how can people know where to go if they don't know where they've been? I spent most of 2020 writing a grant to digitize the AFL-CIO Civil Rights Department records here in the Southeast. We got accepted and we're starting the project. We're really excited. And after we had submitted the first round of the grant, George Floyd was murdered. And then sparked the Black Lives Matter protests over the summer. And it was really reminding me of what we were seeing in the civil rights collection from the AFL-CIO, that this is not a new phenomenon, and that there was this great intersectionality in the civil rights movement between African Americans and the labor movement and religious organizations that is sometimes forgotten about, and that these records hold that story from a different lens. And I think a lot of times people think the Southern Labor Archive, it's just about unions. And yes, we have a lot about unions, but it's also about the lives of working men and women. And these stories are not often told, often forgotten, often thought as not important. And they're the backbone of the United States. They've had such an impact on our culture, on our society, on our everyday lives that are often forgotten. And so that's kind of how I see the archive. It's just preserving and giving access and telling people about these stories.
Thank you. Well, that's a great way to take us out. Well, thank you everybody for coming and for asking such great questions. And thanks to our panelists and organizers for your work here tonight and all the work to set this up. So thank you, everybody. We're going to save the chat. There's lots of great information in it. And Lisa, can you tell us how, and Ryan, can you tell us how the recording will be available after the fact?
That is, so I'm going to save the chat and I will email that out to everyone who attended today. I think that the recording TBD, I guess probably the easiest way is going to be through the archives, but yeah, we'll kind of put our heads together and get that out to everybody as well.
Okay, we might be able to make it available on some of the sponsoring organizations websites as well. What you're going to
Yeah,
say?
that would be great.
I think it'll end up in our digital collections and in our YouTube channel.
Okay, super. Thanks, everybody. Good night. Stay safe.